Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the financial system you trusted your entire life is beginning to crack under pressure. Your savings account is still there. Your retirement fund still exists. The stock market is open. Everything looks normal on the surface, yet beneath that calm appearance, a massive problem has been growing for decades. According to billionaire investor Ray Dalio, that problem is the United States debt crisis. And if he's right, the consequences could affect every American household, every investor, every retiree, and every worker. Dalio has spent decades studying how economies rise and fall. He has analyzed hundreds of years of financial history, examining empires, currencies, debt cycles, and market crashes. His warning today is simple but powerful. America's debt problem is becoming so large that it can no longer be ignored. To understand why Dalio is concerned, we first need to understand what debt really is. Debt itself is not bad. Individuals use debt to buy homes. Businesses use debt to expand operations. And governments use debt to fund projects and services. Debt becomes dangerous only when it grows faster than income. Imagine a family earning $50,000 a year but spending $70,000. At first, they can borrow money to cover the difference, but eventually the debt becomes so large that they spend more money paying interest than improving their future. According to Dalio, the United States is facing a similar challenge. The government continues spending far more than it collects in taxes, forcing it to borrow trillions of dollars every year. The scale of the problem is difficult to comprehend. America's national debt has grown to levels that would have seemed impossible just a few decades ago. Every year, interest payments consume a larger share of the federal budget. That means money that could be used for infrastructure, education, healthcare, or defense is increasingly being used simply to service existing debt. Dalio argues that this creates a dangerous cycle. More debt leads to higher interest costs. Higher interest costs require more borrowing. More borrowing creates even higher debt. The cycle feeds itself until something eventually changes. Many people assume that because the United States is the world's largest economy, it can borrow indefinitely without consequences. Dalio disagrees. He points out that history is filled with powerful nations that believed their financial position was unshakable. From the Dutch Empire to the British Empire, dominant powers often experienced periods where debt grew beyond sustainable levels. Eventually, investors lost confidence, borrowing costs increased, and economic challenges followed. Dalio believes that no country, regardless of its size or strength, is exempt from the basic laws of economics. One reason the United States has been able to sustain such large debt levels is the unique role of the U.S. dollar. The dollar remains the world's primary reserve currency. Governments, corporations, and investors around the world use dollars for trade, savings, and international transactions. This global demand creates a significant advantage for America. It allows the government to borrow at lower costs than many other countries. However, Dalio warns that reserve currency status should never be taken for granted. Throughout history, reserve currencies have changed as economic and political conditions evolved. The world's trust in a currency can remain strong for years and then gradually weaken. Dalio frequently talks about what he calls the big debt cycle. Unlike normal business cycles that last a few years, big debt cycles can unfold over decades. During the early stages of these cycles, that helps fuel economic growth. Borrowing allows consumers to spend more, businesses to invest more, and governments to support economic activity. Growth appears strong and prosperity increases, but eventually debt accumulates faster than the income needed to repay it. At that point, policymakers face difficult choices. They can cut spending, raise taxes, print money, or restructure debt. None of these options are painless. One of Dalio's biggest concerns is the growing gap between government spending and government revenue. Politicians often promise new programs, benefits, and spending initiatives because voters like receiving benefits. At the same time, politicians are reluctant to raise taxes because voters dislike paying more. The result is persistent deficits year after year. Borrowing becomes the path of least resistance. Over time, these deficits accumulate into massive debt obligations. Dalio argues that this problem is not about one political party. It is a structural issue that has developed across multiple administrations and decades. The challenge becomes even greater when interest rates rise. For years, governments around the world benefited from historically low interest rates. Borrowing was relatively cheap. However, when rates increase, the cost of servicing existing debt rises dramatically. Imagine having a mortgage that suddenly becomes more expensive every year. Now imagine that mortgage is measured in trillions of dollars. That's the situation policymakers must confront. Dalio warns that rising interest costs could place enormous pressure on future government budgets. Many Americans assume that economic growth alone can solve the debt problem. Growth certainly helps. A stronger economy generates higher tax revenues and improves debt sustainability. However, Dalio argues that relying solely on growth may be unrealistic. Debt has grown so large that economic expansion alone may not be sufficient to close the gap. If debt continues increasing faster than income, the underlying problem remains. That's why Dalio emphasizes the importance of addressing structural imbalances before they become unmanageable. Another issue Dalio highlights is the potential impact on investors. Financial markets are deeply connected to government finances. If investors begin questioning the sustainability of U.S. debt, they may demand higher yields to compensate for perceived risks. Higher yields mean higher borrowing costs, which can place additional pressure on both the government and the broader economy. Stock markets, bond markets, housing markets, and retirement accounts can all be affected by shifts in investor confidence. Dalio often explains that financial crises rarely happen exactly as people expect. Most individuals imagine a sudden collapse similar to a movie scene where everything falls apart overnight. In reality, debt crises usually develop gradually. Warning signs accumulate over time. Debt rises, deficits expand, interest costs increase, confidence weakens. Then a triggering event accelerates the process. By the time the average person recognizes the seriousness of the problem, conditions may already be changing rapidly. One of the most controversial aspects of Dalio's analysis involves money printing. When governments face excessive debt burdens, central banks often play a role in maintaining stability. This can involve purchasing government bonds or increasing the money supply. While such actions may provide short-term relief, they can also create long-term risks. Increasing the supply of money faster than economic output can contribute to inflation. Inflation reduces the purchasing power of savings and wages. Dalio warns that policymakers frequently choose inflation because it is politically easier than implementing spending cuts or tax increases. Inflation acts like a hidden tax. Most people notice prices rising at grocery stores, gas stations, and restaurants, but they may not fully understand the forces driving those increases. When inflation persists, the value of cash savings gradually declines. Retirees living on fixed incomes can be particularly vulnerable. Dalio argues that understanding inflation is critical because it often emerges as a consequence of excessive debt and money creation. Another factor increasing uncertainty is political polarization. Dalio frequently discusses the relationship between economic stress and social conflict. When wealth gaps widen and financial pressures increase, political divisions often become more intense. Competing groups blame each other for economic challenges. Cooperation becomes more difficult. Consensus solutions become harder to achieve. History shows that periods of high debt often coincide with increased social and political tensions. Dalio also emphasizes the importance of looking beyond short-term headlines. Financial markets can remain strong even while underlying risks continue building. Stock prices may rise. Unemployment may remain relatively low. Consumer spending may appear healthy. These indicators can create a sense of confidence. However, Dalio believes investors should focus on long-term fundamentals rather than short-term optimism. The absence of immediate problems does not eliminate future risks. So, what solutions does Dalio propose? He generally advocates for balancing spending and revenue in a gradual, responsible manner. This does not necessarily mean drastic austerity measures. Instead, it involves making difficult decisions before circumstances force more painful actions, reducing deficits, improving productivity, encouraging sustainable growth, and maintaining confidence in financial institutions are all part of the solution. The goal is to address imbalances while preserving economic stability. For individual investors, Dalio often stresses the importance of diversification because no one can predict the future with certainty. Concentrating wealth in a single asset or strategy can be risky. Diversification across asset classes, sectors, and geographic regions may help reduce vulnerability to economic shocks. Dalio's investment philosophy is always centered on balancing risks rather than making all-or-nothing bets. It's important to recognize that Dalio is not predicting the end of America. His warning is more nuanced than many headlines suggest. He acknowledges that the United States remains an innovative, productive, and powerful nation. American companies continue leading global industries. The country possesses significant economic strength. His concern is that ignoring debt dynamics could gradually undermine those advantages over time. The issue is not whether America will disappear. The issue is whether policymakers will address growing imbalances before they become significantly more difficult to manage. History offers both cautionary tales and reasons for optimism. Countries have successfully navigated debt challenges before. Effective leadership, economic reforms, technological innovation, and responsible fiscal management can produce positive outcomes. However, history also shows that delaying necessary adjustments often increases future costs. Dalio believes that understanding historical patterns provides valuable insight into today's challenges. The reason so many people pay attention to Ray Dalio's warnings is not because he claims to know the future with certainty. It is because he studies patterns. He examines how debt, money, politics, and human behavior interact across generations. His message is that the current trajectory deserves serious attention. Debt itself is not the problem. Uncontrolled debt growth relative to income is the problem. When borrowing becomes a substitute for sustainable growth, risks accumulate beneath the surface. As America moves through the coming years, the debt issue will likely remain one of the most important economic stories in the world. Decisions made by policymakers today could influence interest rates, inflation, investment returns, and living standards for decades. Whether one agrees with every aspect of Dalio's analysis or not, his warning raises an important question. What happens when a nation continues borrowing faster than it can sustainably grow? The answer may shape the future of the global economy. Ray Dalio's core message is clear. The U.S. debt crisis is not a distant problem reserved for economists and policymakers. It has the potential to affect workers, retirees, homeowners, investors, and future generations. The challenge may not create an immediate catastrophe tomorrow morning, but it is a risk that continues growing with time. And according to Dalio, the longer the problem remains unresolved, the more difficult and costly the eventual solution may become. That is why he believes the U.S. debt crisis is worse than most people think, and why understanding it today may be more important than ever before.